Introduce yourself and try and keep it brief, and we'll take a number. 3. Let's take 3 at a time.
David Meckel with the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. I'd like to ask the panelists to comment about the relationship that they perceive between popular mobilization, like the New York March, and democracy. Because the vehicle that we have in many countries for popular pressure to motivate political officials is democracy. And yet, if you look around the world and think to the recent agreement between China and the United States, for example, China is not a democracy, and President Obama's measures are being taken, one could say, in the face of a democratic election result. The world's largest democracy, India, the administration of Narendra Modi, after the deal between China and the United States, exhibited some reluctance to be pressured by that deal. And in fact, the energy minister has said that albeit India has renewable energy goals, coal use is also going to grow. Look at Canada, Australia, democratic elections, returning governments that have taken a step backwards in terms of climate policies. So what do we perceive the relationship between the electorate, popular mobilization, and political officials being going forward?
Good question. There was another hand over there. If you can pass the microphone down there. Let's take 2 more, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
Hi, Tom Mitchell from the Overseas Development Institute. I wanted to really just direct my comments to Michael and thank him very much for the kind of commending of zero-zero. But I also wanted to just highlight to the panel what I see as a connectivity between zero poverty and zero emissions. And that's one that can probably easily be missed, recognizing that the emissions that we already have in the atmosphere have locked in a set of impacts into our climate system that are already affecting the trajectory out of poverty. They're dropping more people into poverty. They're blocking routes out of poverty. And I just wonder whether or not the zero-zero concept could be furnished in a way that highlights the fact that there is already a very well-established interconnectivity between the climate system and a chance of zero poverty, and what that might be that we can help to highlight that communications dimension.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. And there was one more just behind you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Emily Wise, and I'm a volunteer from the Red Cross. You all have mentioned the term leaders, marking an idea of a vertical approach between them and the general population. What are your comments on a more horizontal approach between them and the general population, considering you are suggesting the change of, to making the change of zero poverty, zero emissions within a generation, specifying youth? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you got those questions. Michael, do you want to kick off first?
I'll take the first and the third on democracy and social movements, and including youth within social movements. So the responsibility of politicians is to work out what they should do within their democratic systems and which forces they should be responsible to and how they should respond. And democratic politicians in democratic systems have to do that, but so do politicians in non-democratic systems. And there are always social pressures and political pressures even in formally non-democratic systems. So the Chinese government is responding to very strong social pressures. One of the reasons the Chinese government is now doing more on climate change than many other countries is because of the link with air pollution. And air pollution is killing people, thousands and thousands of people in China, as it does around the world. And that causes social unrest and protests, and the Chinese government is very concerned about these. So the Chinese government, although it's not a formal democracy, is absolutely responding to social forces, and that is true in all countries, or almost all countries. But secondly, we need to remember that as well as the popular pressures that may be visible on governments, there are huge pressures from economic interests. So democracies don't work simply by aggregating the votes of individual citizens. They work usually behind the scenes with immense lobbying and the interconnections between very powerful economic interests and politicians and governments. And the fossil fuel sector has amongst the most important political interests in many, many governments around the world. And social movements are, in a sense, a counterbalance to those. So the social movements around climate change are effectively acting as a counterweight to extremely powerful forces, legitimate forces. I'm not trying to claim that there aren't legitimate forces. Big businesses which employ a lot of people, which earn lots of money, including tax revenues for companies, are absolutely legitimate parts of a political system, but let's not forget that they're there, and similarly with other. So the point of social movements is to ensure that politicians are listening to a variety of voices and not just the most powerful ones and the ones with the deepest pockets. And in the end, the politicians' responsibilities to respond to the range of forces and to the range of potential outcomes. And having been an advisor to a politician in a developed country, I was constantly aware of that process. If you don't have the social movements, the pressures on politicians are very clear, and they are to the status quo and to the interests of the biggest economic voices. Those social movements are crucial to make sure that politicians are responding to the wider circle of views. And let's also be clear, politicians lead as well as follow. No politician thinks that his or her job is simply to reflect the views of voters today. All politicians know that they have a responsibility to lead, to educate, and to think about the long term as well as the immediate concerns of voters now. And that is their responsibility in democracies. And one of the things that the climate movements do is point to politicians, point out their responsibilities to the longer term, to future generations, and to wider understandings which citizens and voters may not have. So it's a complex question, this relationship, but the idea that social movements are not vital to that process is critical. And let's be clear about the role of youth in this. If youth mobilizes in its own forms, and this is now in forms that the older people have not mobilized in the past, we've got very new forms of mobilization, the politicians they need much more from youth than they do from other forces. They tend to discount young people, so the young people's movements have to be even stronger than the movements of pensioners who vote and others, typically in societies. And youth have got more work to do, but what youth cannot do is ask the older people how to do it. If we do that, then it'll be wrong. It'll just be wrong. And so, although you may come to us with that demand, I will only say, do it yourselves and make as much bloody noise as possible, and then you might get the politicians to listen.
Just a quick, very brief comment on the second question, relating to the 0-0 and the link between them. I think from the point of view of the climate process, we moved a long way from a negotiation among meteorologists, and it's clear that the climate change agreement in Paris will be very different from what was, for example, and is the Kyoto Protocol. And I think one of the points that is becoming very clear now is that more elements are coming to the picture of this new agreement, including the fact that there is a strong call for having a political parity between mitigation and adaptation, which is already a step in the right direction. Many calls for the agreement being also a human rights agreement. So there are, the cross-cutting nature of the climate discussion is really bringing in more issues. And the question is how this can be reflected, whether in the main body of the agreement or in subsequent decision around it. But it's happening. It takes a bit more time probably, but it's there.
Thanks. I just wanted to add that coming out of the summit, climate summit, we've seen an unprecedented commitment from leaders. Over 100 heads of state and government participated in the summit. It was the largest ever gathering of heads of state and government on climate change. These leaders converge on a vision to finalize an agreement in Paris, a universal and meaningful agreement in Paris. After the summit, we've seen historic announcements from the US and China And don't forget the European Union. The decision by European leaders in and of itself is also an historic agreement as well. And we've also seen 10 billion in commitments to the Green Climate Fund. So I really don't think that we should think that the political mood is not conducive to an agreement. As a jaded former negotiator who went through Bali, Copenhagen, etc., you know, we are in a relatively good place, or we are in a good place. I better knock on wood so I don't jinx the mood here in Lima. So I think that we are in a good place, and we really just need to build on what has been achieved at the summit, post-summit, into Lima, and on the road to Paris. We're also seeing non-state actors step up to the plate, and I fully agree with everything that Michael said. At the summit, we saw commitments on finance from industry leaders that have previously not participated or seen it fit to make the sort of commitments they made on finance. Commitments from pension funds and other institutional investors. Commitments from commercial banks on climate. Commitments from the insurance industry. So I generally believe that we really have to look at the entire landscape. There is significant action, significant movement, both on the part of governments as well as many non-state actors. Finally, on the issue of the youth. Now, I have a 13-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. They both live in the United States. And they are plugged in, not because of their father preaching to them on climate change, but they are more aware of climate change, its impacts, its causes, the need to be energy efficient. My son is trying to convince me to buy a Prius, which I think I will do. So it starts at home. It is not only about us preaching to others, but those of us who are parents, we really need to speak to our children. We really need to ensure that the practices that we're talking about are embedded within our own lifestyles as well. Thank you.